Today on Ancestors.
Peace, love, the flower child hippie movement, the anti-establishment. I could relate to that because that was very much a part of me inside.
How might the census records have helped you in your own quest?
They're wonderful sources of information. And you can look along the top of this, and I always get excited because of the type of information you have.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
Ancestors, with hosts Jim and Terry Willard.
Do you have an ancestor who fought in the Civil War? Are members of your family listed on the 1790 census, the first ever taken in the United States?
Today we'll visit with an expert who will show us why census and military records are so popular.
But first, let's go to northern Utah and meet Gary Bryant, who, through genealogy, discovered that American history is family history and found his own identity as well.
Peace, love, the flower child hippie movement, the anti-establishment. I could relate to that because that was very much a part of me inside. And so I gravitated towards that movement. I had hair down past my shoulders, had mutton chop sideburns. In fact, a friend of mine, senior year in high school, had enlisted into the Navy for 6 years. And I looked at him and went, God, you idiot. I will shoot myself in the foot. I will blow my leg off. I am going to Canada. I will not do military service for this country. My stepfather was a veteran of World War II. No, that didn't go over real well with him, especially my protest demonstrations and my signs and my love beads and so forth. And he once said, you ungrateful. You don't care about the sacrifice I made. I didn't ask him to do that. So what? Who cares? I was very flippant and cocky. And one day I called my mother and says, Mom, I'm bored. Man, I can't stand this. She goes, go down and talk to the recruiter. And I went, okay, I'm going to go down and give these guys one hard time. And so I went down to the recruiter, and their golden tongue that the recruiters seemed to have just sucked me right in. And so 3 months after I had said I would blow my leg off, I go to Canada, no way will I serve my country, I raised my hand and said, I do. And one night I was sitting in the barracks, bending elbows with about 6 of my comrades. And for some reason, we were talking and got into our family history. And I remember one individual was from New Hampshire, and so he was from early Puritan stock. Another individual was from New Jersey and talked about his grandfather's experience of seeing the Statue of Liberty and so forth. And it went around the group. All of them had something in their family history that gave them some roots. And my comment was, I bet most of my ancestors came here after the Revolution. So what does the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the flag have to do with me? Nothing. I don't care about it. I won't salute it. I won't defend it. I am strictly here in the service to get my 4 years of college. When I got out of the service and went home to Colorado, and I was standing in my bedroom, and my grandmother came in and walked up to me and looked at me and says, "What is wrong? You seem very depressed." And I replied, "Grandma, out of the 60,000 men and women who died in Vietnam, I'm sure a couple of them would like to have lived. And I don't think it's fair because I can't trade places with them. I don't like life. I don't know who I am, what I am, why I'm here, where I'm going." Right after that is when I began seriously to work on finding my family history. I think in family history research, people begin their genealogy with an interest of wanting to find aristocracy, some nobility. But as I researched, I wasn't finding any of this. I was finding a bunch of dirt farmers. As I went through the generations, I started to find several who had served in the military. I had several fight in the King Philip's War, the 1670s. I had 3 who served in the French and Indian War. Then I had 10 serve in the American Revolution. How could I in the barracks say I have nothing to do with the American Revolution, the Constitution? Out of the 10 ancestors that served in the Revolution, the one I can gather the most history on is John Strawn. He enlisted into Colonel Daniel Morgan's riflemen, or Morgan's Rangers. Washington called them his eyes and ears. Their greatest moment came at the Battle of Saratoga. John Burgoyne, the British general, was coming down out of Canada. The armies met at Freeman's Farm. The men who won the battle that day was Colonel Daniel Morgan and his 500 riflemen. And John Strawn, Private John Strawn, was one of those soldiers standing on that battlefield that day. After I had gathered a lot of this information and found this out, I was at an NBA game. The anthem was being played. And I looked up, I was sitting on the floor, and I looked up in the rafters and there was hung the American flag. And I looked at that flag, and it's like I could see, I mean, I didn't see, but it's through my mind was pictures of these ancestors in their uniforms. And this voice in my head saying, "You ungrateful son. Of all that we have done, all that we have endured, all that we have sacrificed, and you don't appreciate any of it. You aren't worthy to be my grandson, to be my descendant." And I stood up, looking at the flag, and I raised my hand. And I have done so ever since. But in 1989, I was sitting there and was noticing that give me another year and this is going to all be done. And how sad it's going to be. Because here is 1,000 pages compiled, and I'm going to take it and sit it on a shelf where it's going to collect inches and inches and inches of dust. And I went, God, there's got to be something else. There has to be. As a photojournalist, the answer came on an assignment. I was, a couple of weeks later, was sent to the local Scottish Highland Games. I don't know if it was the skirl of the pipes, the flash of tartan, the glint of the clan badges. I don't know what it was, but it was like coming home. And then it dawned on me, the next level of family history research is taking that research and teaching your family. Learning about the culture of your forefathers, their traditions, and implementing into your family some of those traditions and some of those cultures. Come alive. Reach back into the past and bring that forward. I feel personally that taking an interest in one's family history, you help to understand who you are, what is expected of you. Why are you here now and not 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 50 years from now, down the road? To me, the study of my pedigree and what they've done has helped me to understand why I am here and what my role is here in this life. One's ancestors want to be remembered. They all want to be remembered. They want their story told and retold so that the generations to come will know where they came from, who they are, and what was sacrificed for them. And when the call comes, and I really hope my sons will never have to serve in the service. But if the occasion comes that they have to do military service, I am not going to balk, because it is the legacy of my family to fight for independence, to fight for liberty, to fight for freedom. That is the role of my forefathers, which has also been handed down to me, which is to be handed down for the generations to come.
You probably know, so far we've introduced the pedigree and the family group sheet as basic tools that people who are interested in their genealogy and family history can use. And they've looked around their home for information, and they've interviewed older family members. But of course, sooner or later, gaps and holes start showing up in these important documents. And we want them to know that when they turn to records, two of probably the most frequently used records are military records and census records. So that's really what we'd like to talk about today.
But before we do the records,
Is this the human
yeah, it's
thing?
always nice to talk about genealogy, because we talk about genealogy as a lifelong hobby, and it's really a lot of fun. And it's always nice to know, how did you get interested in genealogy?
Well, I've always had a real intense interest in history, particularly local history. And I've always been fascinated about my own family as well. I can still remember as a young child some of the exciting things we're doing overnights at Grandma's house.
Yes.
My father's father was deceased before I was born, so he was always the unknown as a little kid. It's like, well, who was Grandpa? I never met him, and here's his wife, my grandma. And one particular time, my brother and I were doing several days at my grandmother's house in Jasper, Indiana, and we happened to ask her about Grandpa. What did he do? Who was he? And we found out his name, Valentine Witcher. The name Valentine still isn't very popular today, and it's like, oh, well, that's kind of neat, and that sort of, started to beg the question, well, who was this Valentine guy, and where did he come from, and how did he come to settle there? All sort of tied together, and been involved professionally for the last 18 years in doing genealogy.
It's neat because we all have that commonality. We all want to know something about where we came from and who we are, and that's why genealogy is such a fascinating hobby. How might the census records have helped you in your own quest?
They're wonderful sources of information. If we could take a look at the 1920 census, as being the census that most people will encounter first in their research.
Why the 1920 census? Why not the 1950 census?
Well, there is that 72-year privacy cap that governs a lot of federal records, including census records. So the 1920 census actually just became available in 1992.
Okay, so information within the last 72 years, federal information is not available for us to see. So we would have to start, this would be the first one that's open.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. That privacy cap sometimes provides a little bit of an obstacle for us. But if we can, again, do great beginning research, talking to living relatives and
Starting with
gathering
ourselves,
information.
that's true. We should be able to
We should be able to get back at least close to 1920. This being the latest census, every census page has a masthead that tells you the census year, tells you the state and county. The county's a little obliterated on this one, but we can look at the page before, the page after to find that. And you can look along the top of this, and I always get excited because of the type of information. You have a column for name and then the relationship of everyone in a particular family. You have some personal description as far as sex and color and age, some citizen education. Beautiful information here, nativity and mother tongue. You will see that because all the mother tongue here would be English, it was not recorded. But in some areas of heavy influx of new migration, that mother tongue can be important in trying to determine some additional information.
Clue. Yeah.
And then your occupation, where you have the trade listed and then the actual job or the profession. You can get just wonderful information about individuals. This particular family here, the Charles Clinton Young family, is my wife's family. Her father, Eugene, is listed here as a 6-year-old child. And you can see from this, everyone that was living in the household at the time, again, all this wonderful information about these individuals. And what we like to encourage people when they're using documents, we like them to really wring all the information they possibly can out of them. And a couple of ways of doing that is to look up and down the page and find if there are relatives who happen to be neighbors. And in this particular case, there is. Mary Farmer was related to Gertrude Louise. Gertrude Louise, before she married Charles Young, was Gertrude Louise Farmer. So on this page, we find some more of her family. And on preceding pages, we also can find members of the Young family. So it's an exciting
I was going to say, this is a good way to fill out family group sheets,
That's
too.
right. You get information that's both for the pedigree
and
and the family group sheet. So it kind of is an ideal way of combining that important information kind of all in one spot. So,
are there any little words of caution you would have for a beginning genealogist about the census?
Well, there are several.
I knew that.
you brought up a good point there.
People being as people have always been, a few things that I think we as researchers need to be aware of. The census takers did have a set of instructions. They interpreted those somewhat liberally sometimes. When they were enjoined to or directed to inquiry at every household about particular individuals, if someone wasn't home, sometimes they might ask a neighbor, and you're not getting first-hand information.
Not real
you're getting
reliable.
second-hand information. While there are no real recorded stories, and it's understandable why not. It's rainy, it's dark, it's cold, it's at the end of the day, there's a house way down the lane. Do I really want to walk down there and ask them? Or should I ask the neighbor? And he gives me or she gives me the information that I need. Some other challenges are handwriting. Sometimes we encourage people just to settle in for a moment and study the handwriting. Pick out some names like Charles that you know, okay, that's Charles. That's how he made his C. That's how he's writing his S's. Deciphering information. And then remembering that mistakes were made. Those little things are
spelling
things
too, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
If they heard a name that was difficult, they might spell it phonetically rather than correctly.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
Well, I was wondering would it be easy for me as a beginning genealogist to access those records?
I believe so. Again,
How would I
census
do that?
records are some of the most plentiful records, having been taken every 10 years, beginning in 1790 up through and including 1920. Many major libraries have collections of federal census records, your state libraries, your major repositories, certainly the Family History Library in Salt Lake and others throughout the country. A lot of your historical and genealogical societies have pieces of the federal census record that cover the area that they're interested in, their county, their region, their state, or even a multi-state area. Wonderful collections, really quite widely available all over the country. So accessing those records really it shouldn't be a problem.
Census records are wonderful, but another very common source of information comes from military records.
What I'd like to know is what military records offer for the genealogist.
Again, another perfect example of a federal government record that really wasn't created necessarily for genealogists, but really serves our purposes very well. They are such a robust collection of records, and again, they're a record that the federal government keeps. And sort of one of the things we can expect from the federal government is lots and lots of paper. And for genealogists, the more paper, the better.
That's right.
And we can find information about people who are not necessarily that famous. Privates have military records. People who may not have been wounded or received medals of honor, they have military records. And what we can expect to find in a lot of military records are tremendous amounts of biographical information. Even though it really doesn't have to do with the bullets and the sabers of the battle, we can find lots of biographical information.
Did you bring some records to show us today?
Yes, I did. The first one here is a few pages out of Revolutionary War pension file for Francis Nicholson. And in this particular document, we have a brief service history being attested to by the witnesses here that essentially give his commanding officer the dates that he was in service. And the interesting biographical section that you can find at the bottom here is that you have his widow essentially attesting to the fact that she was married to him, their marriage date, and their marriage place. So in this military record, we get a nice little piece of biographical information. It really has nothing to do with the war at all. It has to do with her wanting to get his payment for
I
service
also
in the
noticed
war.
it has her maiden name, which is kind
I
of...
think this is actually her married
Oh,
name,
her
and then she
okay.
remarried, and so that's just
But that
proving...
could still lead you to other documents.
Absolutely,
Sure, of course.
absolutely.
There's a wealth of information
The
in
Weston surname there. And you key on an important point of exploring these documents completely. Anyone who's testifying, who is that person, is an important question to ask. Are they a relative? Are they a comrade who was in the unit that may be able to provide some additional information?
So this is a good example of a pension record.
Correct.
A Revolutionary War pension record.
And I think you wanted to...
This
Explain these a little
second
bit.
set here is a collection of records that we would class as service records for this particular person, Paul Abner. And in these payroll cards, we can get the unit that he was attached to, and we get his rank. From that, we can explore regimental histories or unit histories. We find out how much he was paid. And as we float through these cards, we can find out that he was furloughed for fatigue when he was on command at different times. Another unit that he was attached to. The most wonderful place on many documents for me is the other column or the remarks column,
I like
where
that.
you can find again a lot of neat fabric about the particular individual's life that really goes beyond just being a true military data, but some personal data.
Right.
The other thing that I wondered, much with the census, we talked about some of the downside of the census. Are there some downsides to this information? Are there pitfalls, things that we should be careful of?
Well, the handwriting
Right.
continues to be a challenge. The fact that people were just missed for whatever reason. Sometimes on a particular muster, if a person had been captured, he may be considered absent without leave. If he was left in a hospital, there are some times where the detail trail, if you will, breaks down a little bit. But by and large, if the information was recorded, and if you can take the patience and the time to decipher that handwriting, there's some wonderful family information in there.
Right.
Well, so far what we've done then, we've explored how census and military records can help us get more information to build on our pedigree and start filling out our family group sheets. We've seen there are some pitfalls, things we should be cautious, but again, be creative. I think that's
the most fun part about genealogy, don't you think?
I really do. Using the records completely.
And we can't ever
Exploring.
think that all of the information we need is going to be in one place. And the more places we find information, the better off we are.
Right.
Oh, Kurt, thank you so much for sharing your information
Thank you.
with us. It's very, very informative, and we appreciate it a lot.
Thank you very much for coming.
It's wonderful being here. Thank you.
Kurt and Gary have shown us today that military and census records are valuable because they are such rich sources of biographical information.
Keep in mind these 3 tips. First, examine the handwriting carefully and make sure you've copied the information accurately.
Second, verify the information by looking at a variety of records.
Third, contact your local library, genealogical, or historical society for help in finding these records.
You can also get more information from the Ancestors homepage.
Thanks for being with us, and please join us for the next episode of Ancestors.
To learn more about ancestors, visit us at PBS Online at the internet address on your screen.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support ancestors.
You're watching PBS.
Today on Ancestors.
And my friends were all white. I was the only black. So I've been following you all around. We should go to Africa. We've been where all your parents have come from, but we haven't gone to Africa, and that's what we did. At one point, I felt like I had been there before.
Well, it's not always easy. It's sometimes very, very difficult, especially when you find the name of your ancestor, and you might find out that he was a slave, might have been beaten.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support ancestors.
Ancestors, with hosts Jim and Terry Willard.
Increasing numbers of African Americans have had success at uncovering their roots, in spite of the challenges created by their unique and often painful history in America.
Today we'll visit with a genealogist who has helped many African Americans succeed in their search for family history.
But first, let's visit Colette Desvergers, whose search for family history started with a chance meeting in Africa and continues with the support of friends in South Central Los Angeles.
I didn't know how to do it. I had no idea that people were doing it. I mean, like I said, I didn't know anything about genealogy. I didn't even know that the word existed. I had nobody to talk to. Everybody that I talked to, family members, they would give me some information, but when I would try to discuss it a little bit further, or get into other groups and discuss it with people like my friends, nobody was really interested because they said everybody I was talking about was dead, and nobody was interested in talking about the dead. I love Africa, and since I'm a black American and cannot identify with what ethnic group I came from, my goal is to see as much of Africa as I can. I was with some girls I had gone to school with, and we were kind of just visiting different places where they had family members, and we had gone to Spain, we had been in Turkey, and a couple other places. And I said, you know, I've been following you guys all around, and my friends were all white. I was the only black. So I've been following you all around. We should go to Africa. We've been where all your parents have come from, but we haven't gone to Africa. And we said, okay, let's go to the airport and get us a ticket and go to Africa. And that's what we did. But when we got there, they wanted to know, where do you want to go in Africa? And I said, I don't know, Africa. I met Alex Haley the very first time in Gambia at the time that they were there researching to do the movie Roots. And I had a chance to talk to him. And during this conversation, I told him about some of my family members, and he told me that I should pursue the family history. And he also told me where I could go to start getting information. He explained to me that you could go into the research libraries, you should talk to your different family members to get as much information as you can, and write everything down So it was little things like that, little bits and pieces of information like that that he had given me that really pushed me to get out there, to go into the libraries and actually start the research. My research has been stop and go from the beginning. There have been times I've gotten frustrated because I couldn't find certain information. And I've stopped. But prior to that, I think initially the problem was the fact that I did not know how to research. And once I got some information or some type of direction, it kind of pushed me along. I also joined a genealogical society. The society that I belong to, California African American Genealogical Society. And it was formed in 1986 here in Los Angeles. Our meetings are held each month on the third Saturday of the month, and they're held at Martin Luther King Junior Methodist Church in South Central Los Angeles.
It is kind of ironic that people look at South Central Los Angeles and think, wow, this is just a riot going on all the time. But it's not. There are families here in South Central Los Angeles, right here in this church, in Martin Luther King Church. And here is where we have learned how to do genealogy, that is opening doors for us, that is letting us understand who we are and why we exist.
In school, we studied history, but I wanted to know like my own family history. And so my mom started taking me to the library and everything when I was about 8. And ever since, I've been doing my research, and I've gone back really far.
And the next thing I knew, I wanted to know who everybody was. If I could get back to Eve, it would be fine with me.
I was mesmerized, and I just thought, wow, that would be the greatest thing outside of finding the one person that you should marry, would be to find your own roots and discover what your grandparents' lives were like and what their parents' lives were like.
We were not counted as people before a certain period. So that stems from some of us believing that there is no history. So we don't find it. As in my case, I didn't think I should go past the oral history that was given to me. So I found no need to search. But now that I've found other people who are searching and have found, I'm now interested.
And a person can call you all kind of names, but you know where you came from. And if you don't know where you came from, then you should join a genealogy group like this and find out.
My ancestors, of course, are family members, and they're people personally that I want to know where they were at a certain point, where they died, who they were married to. I would just like to know something about their life. And I hope after I'm gone, somebody feels the same, way about me.
I did want to try to validate some of the oral stories that had been passed down from my mother's side and my father's side.
My mother is labeled as being the family's oral historian. And she basically said, well, you'd better get busy and try to document some of this information, because I'm not going to be with you that much longer, and I know everything there is to know about everybody.
There are a lot of challenges. You'll find the biggest one comes from your family. They're all congenital liars, every one of them. Everything that they tell you has a kernel of truth.
I began to ask some of my father's sisters, where are your parents? What happened to them? How did they die?
The records are there. We speak of records being segregated, but the records are there. We just have to keep looking for them.
And I found them in the 1880 census. And when I saw them, all I could do was sit there and cry.
When I started genealogy, although I started with my father's side of the family simply because that was my family name, I must have worked on his side for about 6 months, and I was really successful. In fact, the very first time that I went into the library and pulled out the census and started looking at the 1870 census, and that's the one that blacks were listed by name, the very first census that blacks were listed by name on. I was very lucky that I found family members' names that I had been given. I found them within like 10 minutes of starting to look for them. I was running through that microfilm, and it was like these people were saying, here I am, almost literally jumping off of the pages. It was so many family members and so many names. And like I said, it was people that I'd heard about. I'm Mandy Green and my grandmother Melinda and my great-grandfather, then my grandfather, to see his name like on the next census that came out. A lot of these people, they were dead before I was even born. So this is the closest I can come to them. And then the other people who I knew, it's like, I mean, they were kids. You imagine somebody that you knew at 80 years old, and here they are on a census report at age 6. It's just amazing to me.
I subsequently found that my family had been in California since 1851 or 52. And so for that reason, then, I wanted to investigate this and find out how they got here, what was their status. This was during the days of slavery.
That our family had the strength of spirit to be able to survive something that I don't know if I could ever live through.
Why do you talk about slavery? That's over. Well, my answer is that it isn't over in the sense that it had a very long-lasting effect. It has helped to determine how black people see each other. It has helped to determine how black people see white people, and it certainly has influenced the way white people see black people.
After I talked to Alex Haley, I had gone back to Senegal, and we went to Gorée Island. And in going to Gorée Island, to hear from the curator there at the museum the stories of what went on in Gorée Island. There were a lot of slaves that were held there. A lot of them were held there because they had to be force-fed. They needed to weigh a certain amount in order to be placed on slave ships to make the journey to the Americas. And that was the last transpoint as far as West Africa was, because it was the closest point to the United States. And the thing that impacted me the most was when they told how they split up the families. Like there were a family of 3 or 4. The mother would go to Brazil. The father would be sent to Cuba. One of the children might be sent to Jamaica, and one of the other children would be sent to the Americas, or to the United States. So they would know that they would have no way of ever getting together again. I had walked away from the group, and a couple of people were saying, we're going in this direction. I said, yeah, I know, I'll catch up with you. I finally walked up, and someone came along and said, do you know where you're standing? And I said, no, I just wanted to get a better view because it was high. And when I walked up a couple more steps, he said, well, you're standing on the auction block. I don't know, I never felt like that before. It was like, basically, you could hear voices. At one point, I felt like I had been there before. Now I know why I'm always running around all over the country and like to travel. Why I had a couple of relatives who were traveling all the time. I mean, even as slaves, they were always running off someplace, so it's in my genes. There's nothing I can do about it. I also know, and I especially understand by doing genealogy, that if the things did not go on and if everything did not happen exactly the way that it happened, I would not be sitting here talking today.
Tony, tell us how you got started in genealogy.
Well, it actually happened when I was in college. I was attending a lecture that happened to be given by the late Alex Haley. And I was very fascinated about his story, and I said, wow, I'd like to do that one day before I die. And it happened 6 years later. I was reading a newspaper article, and it was about doing genealogy and about a book that you can get. And I thought, and I said, wow, I remember Alex talked about that. So I ran out and I got the book, and I started reading it. Then I talked to my mom, talked to my dad, my grandparents, and then I got hooked. So it's a lot of fun.
Once the bug bites.
Yeah.
So far, what we've encouraged our viewers is that starting genealogy, you always start with yourself, and you work back in time, one generation at a time.
Sure.
You interview your older family members. You start getting information down on the pedigree and the family group records. And of course, sooner or later, you get to records and start filling in the gaps. In doing African-American genealogy, is there any major difference there at all?
Well, we use similar records, but because of our unique experiences here in the United States, because of racism and segregation, we have to take a slightly different approach when we do genealogy. We do start with ourselves and work backward, and the main thing that we really want to do is get the oral history from our relatives. So I can never stress that too much by talking to their older relatives. In fact, in my class, I have my students make a list of all their living relatives and interview everyone before you go out to do any type of research. Once you go into the library, you have to know a little bit about Black history and the history of African Americans here in this country, because the records are going to reflect that experience here. Looking at it from a genealogical strategy point of view, you always start with yourself and proceed backward like you have mentioned, and we're talking about 3 distinct time periods in history. We're talking about the history of segregation, which right precedes us. Before then, we get into the period of Reconstruction right after the Civil War. And then prior to then, we're getting into the slavery period. And each period has its own set of unique circumstances.
What's the time frame for this period you're referring to, the segregation?
Well, segregation legally ended around 1954 with the Brown versus Topeka decision, and then the civil rights movement and struggle that followed afterward. So again, in doing genealogy, starting with ourselves and moving backward into time, you know, it doesn't take long to get to 1954, okay? And either ourselves or our parents or our grandparents definitely lived through that particular period. But that takes us back to at least to the turn of the century and even before the turn of the century.
If an African American were beginning to do the research and they tie into this period of segregation, what are some of the records they're going to run into?
One of the first groups of records you want to think about are vital records, things like birth certificates, death certificates, and marriage licenses. I have some examples here, particularly from Alabama, where you see that here's a listing of births, deaths, and marriages, but you see here that many of them are segregated by race. So if you're not aware of that, you can send for a record or look for a record and not find your ancestors there, and not knowing that the records were actually segregated.
Does that mean when I go to the courthouse or when I write to them, I would have to specify that?
Sometimes you should, yes. Sometimes the clerks know, sometimes they don't. But if you know there was definitely an African American, then you would want to tell them that this was an African American so they could check that particular index.
What other sources should people be looking for?
One of the things that was very helpful for me was using city directories. City directories were just like telephone directories, but before the telephone was invented. So they're very easy to use, and I tell my students, let your fingers do the walking. So again, an example from Spartanburg, when I first started to utilize the city directory, I didn't find my ancestors in there, and then I realized that the reason I didn't find them was the fact that they were in the back of the book, kind of like riding the back of the bus. Okay, so once I re-examined the city directory, I found out that the whites were in the front of the book and the coloreds were in the rear of the book. So once I went to the rear and went through the colored department, then I found my ancestors listed in the directory. Speaking of vital records, another record that is available are lynchings that happened in the United States. This is a very dark, painful period of our past, but it's something we cannot gloss over and forget and neglect about. A number of my students in my class had told me that some of their ancestors had been lynched and asked specifically, were there any records of lynchings? Well, I found a book by Ralph Ginsberg that's titled 100 Years of Lynchings. And this book documents 5,000 lynchings in the United States. So someone can use this if they heard that their ancestor was lynched and find out the exact circumstances of when it happened and where it happened.
That certainly seems as though that would be an oral tradition that would exist within a family. If something that traumatic had happened in a family, it would have been passed on. So
sometimes it was and sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was so painful and the whole family had to move. That's why some people moved from the south to the north to get away from the lynchings. So in that situation, when an African American would sit down with their parents or grandparents and ask them about the family history, sometimes, you know, they didn't say anything. And it's hard for us to figure out why. Well, sometimes that reason was the fact that someone in the family had gotten lynched and the memory was so painful it was kind of repressed.
Deal with it. You're working back through time. You've worked back through the segregation period. What next?
Well, what some people do is they pick up on the census records, and then they take the census records, they can find their ancestors straight back, and then they try to get into the slavery period. Or they've heard from the oral history that one of their ancestors were slaves. Well, even though you might know that one of your ancestors were slaves, you don't have enough information to run off and start researching slave records. And you really don't have enough information to really start researching slaves on the census records. You need to stop for a moment and go through the Reconstruction period. Reconstruction followed the Civil War in 1865. And they say it's Reconstruction because the country was in the midst of a war. The country was divided. Now we've got to put it back together. We've also got former slaves that are now free. They need services and they need assistance. So there were many government agencies set up to try to make the transition from slavery into freedom. So there's a rich, rich source of records during this particular period. There were bank records. There were letters sent for people trying to find their relatives. There was a whole agency called the Freedmen's Bureau that was set up. The technical name is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And their job was to assist former slaves, but it was also to assist refugees who were fleeing from the war.
So this is the period of time, Reconstruction. What comes as we start with ourselves and work back? What do we move into from there?
Well, once you move back to there, you'd want to look at records from the U.S. colored troops, which were blacks that fought during the Civil War. And I think you had a section on military records where you talked about Civil War research. Once you finish that, then you're actually ready to look into the slavery period. But one thing that researchers need to be aware of, all African Americans were not slaves. There were many freed African Americans prior to the Civil War in the North as well as in the South. There were hundreds of thousands of freed African Americans in the South. So you need to try to make some kind of determination if your ancestors were slave or they were free.
And if they were free, would their records be in civil records?
Yes, actually, they would. So you would research on similar veins as everyone else did. You go to the census records and go to the other vital and county records. It's important to know the slave owner because when you look at records, slaves were considered property. So there are no actual records listed by the slave's name. So you won't be able to go to records and actually look for your ancestor's name directly. Also, slaves were not recognized by surnames. So they were only listed in most of the records by first names. So since they were considered property and you can't look for them directly, you have to look to the records of the slave owner. And then some of those would list the name of his slaves, which would be your ancestors.
And those would be records like wills, deeds, and mortgages, that kind of record?
Right, exactly.
This sounds like an incredible task, almost discouraging.
Well, there's a lot of genealogical societies that have sprung up within the last 10 to 15 years, and making an alliance with one of the genealogical societies can really help because there's been developing quite a number of African American genealogists that have some experience that can really help people out and kind of show them some of the ropes. They have meetings on a regular basis.
So if a person is beginning African American genealogy, would they be able to go to a local? Are there some really some local ones where they could get some help to start?
Oh, sure, absolutely. In fact, there's a number of them in most of the major cities around the country. And it's a matter of when you go to the library, oftentimes they're listed in the guides to genealogical associations, genealogical societies. So there's, fairly easy to get in contact with.
I know one thing, and I don't want to put you on the spot.
Sure.
Everything we've looked at, the potential to come face to face with a lot of pain and a lot of anger. How can you deal with that?
Well, it's not always easy. It's sometimes very, very difficult, especially when you find the name of your ancestor and you might find out that he was a slave, might have been beaten, might have had his family split up. Sometimes it's very painful. But I think we get a richer, deeper understanding of our family and also of history so we can place things into context. I think it also lets you understand what we're going through today and what we've been through, and hopefully that will help us tomorrow.
The healing power of genealogy.
Yes, exactly.
If I can just summarize in a nutshell,
Sure.
obviously we want to start with ourselves, work backward in time, one generation at a time, interview the older family members, start writing this down, start doing pedigree charts, family group records, turn to the records, and here's, and what I really hear, and it's wonderful to hear, you've got to have a good sense of black history, you have to have a good sense of American history.
Exactly.
Go through the period of segregation. Remember that even today, even in the advent of civil rights, the records are still segregated. You have to remember that division is there.
Exactly.
Work back into the period of Reconstruction, into the Civil War, and then into the slavery period.
Exactly.
Be patient.
Exactly.
Persevere.
Exactly.
It's a
You've got
challenge,
it.
but it's worth it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Tony, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. It's been a very, very great pleasure dealing with you today.
Thank you. It's really been enjoyable for me, too. I appreciate it. Great.
We've learned today from Tony and Colette that African American genealogy can be challenging, but also very rewarding.
Keep in mind the following tips.
First, start with yourself and work back from there, one generation at a time.
Second, interview your oldest living relatives for family history stories.
Third, a good knowledge of African American history will help you in your search.
Many cities across the country have African American genealogical or historical societies that can help you get started. You can also visit the Ancestors homepage.
Thanks for being with us, and please join us for the next episode of Ancestors.
To learn more about Ancestors, visit us at PBS Online at the internet address on your screen.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
You're watching PBS.
Today on Ancestors.
Someday I'm going to go to his grave and talk to him and tell him I understand his suffering because I suffered it too. And because a very smart doctor wrote a good death certificate that gave me the information I needed to live.
A lot of times clinically, what's also very important is information about the disease itself. That's not as easy to get, which is one of the reasons that I would certainly encourage people to start.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
Ancestors, with hosts Jim and Terry Willard.
You've inherited more from your ancestors than your family name. You've also inherited your genetic makeup.
We'll talk today with a genetic scientist and a genetic counselor who will help us better understand the link between genetics and genealogy.
But first, let's go to Washington, D.C. and meet TV journalist Carol Krause, who found that knowing her family's medical history made the difference between life and death.
We were a very close family growing up. We did everything together. We had very happy times as children. And so when my mother was hit with ovarian cancer, we were devastated. I couldn't understand why someone who had given so much of herself to help other people would be stricken. When my father was diagnosed with cancer, he was in his 70s, and it was prostate cancer, so it didn't seem like that would be a genetic thing. But in the process of all his treatment, they discovered a tumor in his ureter, which is a very rare tumor. And lo and behold, his brother Hank had died of a tumor in his ureter a few years before. And we sat there Well, my father was ill and began to count up the people, and it was horrendous. His sister Bertha had died when she was 41 of what we thought was stomach cancer. His brother Hank had died in his early 60s of ureter cancer. His brother Wally had died of pancreatic cancer and when he was 51. Wally's daughter Barb had pancreatic cancer when she was 51. She had endometrial cancer when she was 49. On my mother's side, my mother had died when she was 56 of ovarian cancer, and her mother had been diagnosed in her 50s with uterine cancer, and we began to look at this list and go, oh my God, what is going on? And so we swung into action. We started to research every angle we could. We knew that the secret was somewhere in our medical family history, and we began to send away for death certificates, which is the quickest way to find out details of medical family history. Even then, though, we weren't convinced it was something that would affect us anytime soon. So we put the material away for a while. And then a few years later, my sister Susan, at the age of 38, the youngest of the four of us, was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And I almost fell apart. I remember talking to Susan on the phone and just hanging up the phone and falling down on the kitchen floor sobbing because I was sure that we were all going to be hit. But we got ourselves together and started talking to every doctor we could find. We were told that we had to do three things. One, get a mammogram because breast cancer could be in the syndrome. To have a colonoscopy, have our colons checked all the way up to the top. It's a difficult procedure, but because colon cancer was in our family, and that we should consider having a prophylactic hysterectomy and oophorectomy, a preventative removal of our uterus and ovaries. My sister Kathy went in, and she had the preventative removal of her ovaries and uterus, and then we were in for another shock. They found a tumor in both her ovary and uterus. At the time, it was very early stage, and they thought they'd caught it in time. Peggy went in for the preventative removal, and her organs, her female organs, were found to be cancer-free. A month later, I went in for my tests, and they did a routine colonoscopy, as they had done on my sister's. And then there was another shock. They found a small tumor in my colon. I had no symptoms. I was 40 years old. The only reason I went in to get the colonoscopy, 40-year-old women don't get them, was because of my family history. And I know that I would be dead today had we not had that family history, because they discovered the tumor, it was early stage, and they got it out in time. People say to me, why would I want to know? I get that a lot. But if I hadn't have known, I would be dead. That's what I tell them. Ernst. Also, I tell them, if you have children, you have an obligation to know your family history because they need to know what's ahead of them. These cancers, or with many inherited diseases, they hit younger than they normally hit. Might be that extra incentive that they need to do the right thing with their health. My sister Catherine fought her ovarian cancer for 5 years. And I think we had those 5 extra years as a gift, and it was only because she had an early diagnosis. It ended up her cancer was very aggressive, and she died last month. But because of that medical family tree, we had her for 5 extra years, and that was a real gift to our family. This is a death certificate for my Aunt Bertha. I got back in the mail my Aunt Bertha's death certificate. She died in 1942. She was 32. She was my father's sister. He had always told us she died of stomach cancer. Clear as day on the death certificate, it said ovarian cancer. It also said she'd had surgery just 6 months earlier. So we knew it was a pretty definitive diagnosis, and we were shocked. And then suddenly we understood why we'd been hit so hard. We had ovarian cancer at a young age on both sides of the family. Right here, my grandfather, Ernst, who's your great-grandfather, I sent away for his death certificate. And this says cancer of the cecum, but that's a part of the colon. And that's the exact same place where I had a tumor. And because I had this death certificate, doctors knew that they had to look in that part of my colon. And that's what saved my life. I know there are lives out there to be saved. And that's how I've turned my energy. First, I turned it on my family and did a tremendous amount of work. Many family members, cousins, aunts, uncles, are getting colonoscopies. They're getting routine screening. Little potential dangerous things have been found. In a couple of cases, cancer has been found. So I know lives are being saved because as a family we've gathered together and we are making the best out of a very bad situation. And that's the only way we've been able to survive. Researching your family history or your medical family history has some serious sides to it, but also has some very exciting sides to it. You have about 100,000 genes in your body. Half of them come from your mother, half from your father, and that means 25% come from each grandparent, 12.5% from each great-grandparent, and so on. And so when you think about that, we have inside us little living pieces of all the people who came before us. And so it's really interesting to find out something about those people. It doesn't do any good to be ignorant because they're all inside you. They're all living inside you. All your relatives are in there. Sometimes I feel like I'm on a soapbox about this, and I think back to my grandfather, my great-grandfather Philo, who was the preacher on the prairie, who used to get in his wagon and go around from tent to tent. Of course, he was talking about the gospel, but sometimes I think of him when I get out and I talk to people about how important it is to look into your family background. I can feel him inside me. I know that I have little pieces of him inside me, and in a way, he's part of my inspiration and part of my strength. What happens if you find out that there is something on your family tree? What can you do? You're not necessarily going to prevent any of these illnesses on your family tree, but you might be able to short-circuit them and stop them before they get too serious. The second thing you can do is plan your life accordingly and understand what's important in your life. And I don't know when the next cancer is going to hit me. I hope it never does. I'm so well screened. They ought to catch it early, but you never know. So I plan my life accordingly. I live it. I'm not wasting any time. I live it because I don't know what's happening next. And that's one thing that a family tree can give you. You just grab those great times in between the hard times. And that's what we've done. That's why I adopted Emma, my daughter. It was a life that might have gone unnoticed, might have been troubled, might have gone into foster care. And we wanted to bring her into our family and give her some of the good times that we were able to give her. And she's been a gift for us. And it's a good example of how when one door closes, another one does open. I was ill. I had to have my female organs removed. I never would have adopted a child. I have a lot of scars. I've had 2 major cancer surgeries. And it's very sad for me to be reminded of it over and over again. But it also reminds me of the gratitude I have to be alive when my sister and so many other family members aren't. Sometimes I look at the photo of my grandfather Ernst, the one who had the tumor in the same exact spot that I had it. He died when he was 33. I never met him. And I look at his face and I can see myself in his face. I haven't yet had the nerve to go to his grave, but someday I'm going to go to his grave and talk to him and tell him I understand his suffering because I suffered it too. That because he died young and because a very smart doctor wrote a good death certificate, that gave me the information I needed to live. And I want to tell him that. It would just be nice if they would know that their suffering didn't go for naught. They suffered, someone wrote it down. That's why the history is so important. Someone wrote it down. And a whole new generation is going to be saved because of it.
With our background in genealogy, we've attended several conferences over the last decade, and we've seen a tremendous growth in the interest of this whole topic of genetics and genealogy. I guess I have to ask the obvious question up front. What is the relationship between genetics and genealogy?
Well, first, I think that that interest in genetics is really wider than the genealogy community. It's really everywhere we look these days. Time Magazine, U.S. News and World Report, and it's hardly a week goes by, it seems, that the New York Times isn't relating the story of the identification of some new gene. And I think, from my perspective, a lot of the interest, which is the really explosive interest, has been due to the fact that we're making huge leaps in our understanding of the genetic makeup of our cells and is beginning to tell us more and more about how we become exactly what we are, even as unique individuals.
And what that's done, I think, is that's helped families sort of become aware of the fact that it's important to know about not just me, but brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, because now the health of my extended family members can impact on my health. And I think that's another reason that there's been a nice mesh between people who have been interested in collecting information about families and now people who want that information just because now it does pertain to me in a different sort of way.
We've been encouraging people to start their own family history and genealogy and start gathering this information, and we've used the pedigree
and family group sheets.
And family group sheets as the basic tools they should be working from. Is there an advantage to building a medical pedigree?
Absolutely.
Oh, I think so, yeah. The information can often be of really very great value to yourself or other family members. If there are predispositions being transmitted in your family, you can sometimes learn about those through the study of the pedigree. That can be very useful information for your physician or your genetic counselor.
How do geneticists chart a family medical pedigree?
Well, what we traditionally do is something that's in a graphic form, called a pedigree as well. Rather than use words, we tend to use symbols. And what I did today is I brought an example of what a pedigree would look like as it's being completed. This arrow refers to the individual who's actually coming in, who has the questions, who starts the pedigree analysis. Circles, round and curvy, represent females, and men are square. So that's kind of how the way we work it. This line, the horizontal line here, would represent a marriage, and then this would represent their offspring or their children. If you go up from this woman, these are her parents and then her grandparents, and then she has one sister and one brother. So this is the kind of way in which we can chart family relationships relatively quickly without having to say, you know, father, sisters, daughters, son, kind of.
So when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at this couple. This would represent their children.
Exactly.
Their grandchildren.
Exactly.
And their
great-grandchildren. And in generations. So you can actually see those generations defined very clearly. What we then do after we've charted the relationships is we then add some information about individuals. And if we wanted to use this individual, her father, as an example, he was born in 1918. He had what we call age of onset. This round circle here defines prostate cancer. He developed prostate cancer at age 61, or age of onset was 61, and then died in 1990. So we would have some information that we would like to have on here. This particular chart actually represents a cancer family, but obviously there's going to be a variety of diseases in any family, and each individual would be charted with whatever medical condition they had. What we traditionally do then is create a legend. Quite frankly, you can use any symbols you want as long as you're consistent one from another, and that you do identify.
So two symbols that look the same would indicate that that person, those people share the same disease.
And to tie this in with doing genealogy, you have some information that's easily accessible through birth and death certificates. So that's part of our ongoing research anyways as genealogists.
And that's a real good point. I appreciate your bringing it up, because I think one of the issues is that we would obviously, whenever you come into a clinic, bring as much information as you have. And quite frankly, many death certificates, information from death certificates becomes real important. A lot of times clinically, what's also very important is information about the disease itself, the age of onset, exactly what the disease was. And a lot of times that's not as easy to get, which is one of the reasons that I would certainly encourage people to start and then come back with information, and then we can help focus and direct it.
But once we have this information, what are some of the issues involved with what we do with this information, how we use this information?
I guess from my perspective, the central issue is one of an individual's sense of privacy and confidentiality. Because of the relationship of our genes to other family members, when we discover something about ourselves, it often has very important implications for other family members as well. So, and that immediately raises these issues of privacy. Who wants to know How do they want to know it? If something can be done, it's important to know it, but still we may want to not be privy to that information. And yet when a sister receives the information, that if you're a sibling can have can give you important information which you may or may not want.
So what you're saying is even if I don't want to know, even if I'm one of those persons that doesn't want to know and won't do anything about it, that I should still put it in my family history because my cousins or someone in my family might be valuable for them.
I think another example really has to do with the fact that when you talk about families, it's more than just biology. Intellectually, you can understand it's biology, but people come in sort of named after their grandparents, have some of the same skills or talents. My grandmother did incredible artwork, and that's my experience. And then my grandmother also died of ovarian cancer at age 43. And so even though biologically it may not, in fact, fall that way, there's sort of a sense of I looked like her, I had the same body habitus, and so it's fascinating, again, to look at the dynamics of a family that are so much more than just the biology.
But knowledge can go so far in putting fears to rest. I mean, it's better, I think almost better to know and be sure rather than to wonder. I mean,
but this is a very subjective area.
Yes.
Not everybody shares that feeling. I do understand what you mean, and many people feel that way, but others not. Part of it is the sense of inevitability, almost doom sometimes, that people feel when they learn that they have inherited a genetic condition. Sometimes it is true that there's very little to be done about the disease. The gene has been found, but the therapies have not yet been discovered. In other cases, however, and I think it's very important to realize that there is not an essential inevitability to genetic disease. There are often interventions that can be made, drugs that can be taken. In some cases, you might want to alter your lifestyle, the way you go about organizing your life. I probably shouldn't say this since I'm a professional practicing geneticist. Not everything is genetic. And many of the things that you see among your family members are not due to genetic inheritance in the family. So I think before we become fixated or obsessive with respect to what has happened in our families, we need to sort of temper that with a little realism. Yes, there are genetic disorders, medical conditions that result from inheritance of damaged genes, but a whole lot of human disease is only at most marginally related to genetic inheritance.
What would the downside of this be, of genetic research and its implications in genealogy and so forth? What would the negatives be?
Well, there are some, in a sense, social problems associated with genetic information, which are, in some ways, I think, artifacts of the way we deliver health care. Those are I think, the main problems that affect people. When you sign up for insurance, you're often asked, what should we know about? What are you at risk for? Insurance, of course, companies are in the business of not insuring people who are at high risk, to put it quite bluntly. And if you have a genetic predisposition and reveal that, that could affect your ability to gain medical insurance, life insurance. So I think it's certainly something to be concerned about as you begin to explore what your genetic risks might be for specific diseases.
In relative terms, your respective fields are really in their infancy. What's going to happen 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road?
The crystal ball.
The crystal ball. I mean, you've got the unique position. You're on the inside looking out.
Well, the next step really is understanding the biology. And that, I think, is probably where we're going to spend the next 5, 10, 15 years. There's a lot of discussion these days about the Human Genome Project, sort of this major governmental project to map all of a representative human genome, all of the genes in a what is it? Help me with this.
To make up the human.
Thank you. But we didn't pick you or pick me. We picked sort of some ubiquitous human being.
But it wouldn't matter. We're the same.
Okay, fine. So if we take that one gene, all the families that have been able to help, hone in on that particular gene, the beauty now is to understand where we're going to go with it. I mean, the culmination of the Human Genome Project really, even though that's a major endeavor, at some point really is just the beginning, because now you get to start understanding what these genes do, how they interact with each other, how they interact with the environment, and that's when you really can help it make sense to people.
So if I can kind of pull all this information together, we're saying that a medical pedigree is just a natural extension of doing your family research. I mean, basically, we're looking for the same information: birth, death, document the information. We've only added AO, which is age at onset, but it still makes a logical extension of the work that people are already doing who are getting started in family history research. Once they gather this information together, they should immediately probably consult their family physician if they have any reason for concern. I mean, they've gathered information. They certainly shouldn't make any assumptions on their own. They certainly shouldn't diagnose their own chances of contracting a particular illness. So they should consult a physician. It's going to reach a point where the information they've gathered is a matter of choice, whether it's used or not, by themselves or by other people. And one of the important things is that they're gathering information for future generations, so that the medical history is really a vital part of a family history. Some people would argue you can't have a complete family history without a medical history.
I would.
Oh, that's wonderful. This has added information to us that adds a whole new dimension to gathering family data, and we really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having us.
We've learned today that knowledge gained from compiling our family's medical history can be life-saving.
Keep in mind the following 3 tips.
First, a medical pedigree is an important part of your family history.
Second, consult your physician if you have any questions about your family medical information.
Third, remember, sharing the information you find is a matter of choice, your choice.
Contact your local library for more information about family medical pedigrees. You can also visit the Ancestors homepage.
Thanks for being with us, and please join us for the next episode of Ancestors.
To learn more about Ancestors, visit us at PBS Online at the internet address on your screen.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
This is PBS.